Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. I'm William Bell, and with me tonight is Dr. Don Preston. Don, how are you doing tonight?
Well, I'm somewhat relieved. I didn't know you were here until you spoke.
Well, I was taking care of some preliminary business. I had just got off the phone with the brother Elvin Israel. We've been working on some things. We had a class last night with about 5 people, and
awesome.
We scheduled some additional classes. And he was introducing me to another brother from New York, and we were talking to him about some things. And so I was pasting the link in several sites on Facebook so that people could have access to the broadcast. And I realized I had a countdown of like 55 seconds to get in, and I managed to do it. So you know how I am about coming in under the wire. So.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes, I guess it's true. I thrive on it, as some people say. But nevertheless, we are here, and I'm excited and delighted to be spending some time with you again. So, what's going on in Preston's world? And go ahead.
Well, as they say, very, very busy. Of course, this is a short week. This is, as everyone knows, Thursday will be Thanksgiving. I've been trying to get things orderly and arranged to where I can actually take the time off. And, William, as you know, here in town, my best friend and I have had a shop rented for storage for some time. And about 2 weeks ago, a little over 2 weeks ago now, working on 3 maybe, they sold the property and told us we had 30 days to get out. And it has been absolute chaos trying to find, number one, try to find a place. Number 2, trying to find a place we could afford, because believe you me, we've been renting this on a shoestring budget between the 2 of us. And so we finally found a spot. Has no electricity, but at least it's dry. And so we've been trying to get moved in. Well, unfortunately, the building actually has a ton of stuff in it that belongs to the landlord. And he told us, he said, well, I'll get that stuff out. Well, he hadn't got it out yet. And our deadline to get out of our deadline to get out of our building is rapidly closing in. And we still don't have room in the shop that we've supposedly got rented. I was talking to my buddy this morning, and I said, hey, you need to talk to him and just make sure that he's not going to be charging us rent, since we're not even able to move in yet. I mean, we moved in a few odds and ends, but we certainly have not moved in the bulk of our stuff, certainly haven't moved in the large part of it or the larger pieces of it. So, I mean, here we are. We're caught between twixt and two. We can't move in and we can't move out. And boy, oh boy, it's super frustrating. And then on top of that, naturally trying to keep up with my ministerial duties and what have you. So what's that old saying, up to my eyeballs in alligators? That's kind of the way it is right now.
Well,
but you know how that goes. Your life is kind of hectic as well.
Yeah, it's bouncing up and down just the same. I'm dealing with some rental property issues and trying to get all of that stuff straightened out, and it's just back and forth, and I don't even want to talk about it.
Yes.
How that goes. But that, along with trying to get some study in and get things settled. But I'm excited about some studies that I'm doing. I'm really, really looking forward to presenting some of this information in the future, and just looking great. And as I was mentioning before, these opportunities that are opening up. Man, I mean, this is just really, really exciting to see people. I think I taught last night in a private class for about maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. I don't know. And, everyone was still there just listening and interested, So the interest is really, really growing. I think you're going to see some really phenomenal things happening over the next year with the foundation that's being laid, now in some of the things that we're doing. So we're excited about that. And we keep
I don't blame you a bit. That is so exciting. And, we continue to hear from our end about people from literally everywhere who are coming to understand covenant eschatology. I've received some emails over the last few days that have just been so thrilling of people who are finding the liberty and the freedom in Christ, who are coming to understand Bible prophecy, as they say, for the very first time in their life, and just, thrilled absolutely to death. And, what's interesting and gratifying is that so many of the book orders that we are getting right now, certainly some of them are repeat purchases from people who have been buying our books for quite some time. But the thrilling thing about it is that right now the majority of our book orders are coming from people that we literally have never heard of before. People who are watching the YouTube videos, who are taking advantage of the special discounts that we offer, who are just simply they are enthralled by the message. And I shared with you, I think it was last week, about the contact from Costa Rica, and we're looking forward to developing that. Other contacts continue to come in all of the time. And so, as we have said so very, very often on this program, we are living in such exciting times. I know what you are experiencing there is so tremendously exciting. I'm thrilled right now, William, as I always am when I'm almost through with a project. I am closing in on the final editing of a major new book entitled The Death of Adam, the Life of Christ. I did several hours of editing on it today, more pagination, more chapter heading, and that type of editing today. I will be sending that manuscript to you for you to look at it and to write a foreword if you're interested in doing that. I always value your insights into my work. But Lord willing, that will be published no later than April, hopefully sooner than that. But it really is a major work, and it deals with a topic that is so fundamental to the entire study of eschatology, and that is what is the nature, what is the definition of the death introduced by Adam. William, you will remember, because you were my moderator, that in my 2017 formal public debate with Dr. David Hester, professor at Faulkner University, I had asked David prior to the debate in written questions, is physical death the enemy of the child of God? And David Hester responded by saying, no, physical death existed prior to sin. It was a part of the natural created world. Well, I mean, the only conclusion that one can draw from that is if If physical death existed prior to sin, then since God, prior to sin, declared that his entire creation was good, very good, then that means that physical death itself was not bad. It was part of the good creation. And I pressed that point, and I pressed that point. Well, strangely enough, on Facebook over the last several days, Kyle Mazingale, who was his moderator in the second debate, he claimed that David Hester turned that argument on me, and I completely abandoned the argument. That's just an outright falsehood. As you well know, I pressed that argument right through the very last of my speeches. He never addressed the argument. He knew he was entrapped by that. And yet, here is Kyle Mazingale, his moderator, it is 2 years, full year after the debate, trying to make it sound like I'm the one that abandoned the argument when that was one of my foundational arguments that David Hester never addressed.
Absolutely.
Now, you talk about trying, what do they call that, going into the spin room? Boy, I'm telling you, they've got that on spin cycle. So, but that goes to the very nature, it goes to the very foundation of eschatology itself. I have been attacked, you have been attacked on Facebook repeatedly for pointing out that the death introduced the day Adam and Eve sinned was spiritual death. This Kyle Mazingale accused me of teaching that Adam and Eve's spirit died. I've never said anything closely resembling that. I've never hinted at that. You've never hinted at that. We define spiritual death as alienation from God, separation from God, loss of fellowship. And so today I called Kyle Mazingale out on it. I said, here's your quote in which you say that I said that man was created imperfect and his spirit died. I said that is a false representation. That is a false accusation. I have never said that. I've never hinted at that. That's just your imagination, so to speak. And I haven't checked to see if he's responded to that. But this kind of false representation of what we believe, as you know, William, I mean, this has been going on for years and years and years.
Yeah. You make a point and support it as a legitimate argument, and then they come back and argue everything that you didn't say.
Exactly. They establish what they call red herring arguments, which are totally irrelevant arguments. They set up straw man arguments as if they set up an argument, in other words, that they claim it's what you argued and you didn't even come close to arguing that, which is exactly what this is. When Kyle Mazingale said that I had argued that spiritual death is the death of the human spirit, I've never hinted at that. You've never hinted at that. That's a straw man argument. But when they can say, well, Preston says that the spirit died, but the Bible says the spirit is eternal. Oh, well, look at here. See how easy it is to refute Bell and Preston? Well, yeah, it's easy to refute Bell and Preston when you make up arguments that we never made and that we do not make. And so that's what happens, but it all gets back to the death of the garden. And I have to tell you, I am really, really excited about this book. The more I have written, the more I have researched, the more I have examined traditional Christianity, the, quote, historical view of the church, unquote, and what it says, you really have to be quite amazed at how utterly contradictory it is to what the Bible actually says. I mean, the commentators are absolutely full of comments on, well, God did threaten that they would die that very day. Now, we know they didn't die physically. They did die spiritually, but they began to die physically. Well, that's not what the Lord said. The Lord never said, you will become mortal. The Lord never said you will receive the death sentence. The Lord never said you'll begin to die at all. And so when you begin to examine what the Bible actually says, and you contrast that with what Christianity has been saying for almost 1900 years, you literally stand amazed at how much in violation of the biblical text traditional Christianity truly is. And of course, you have those people who are so sold out to the creeds, they're so dedicated to church history, that they literally say things like, how dare you question church history? How dare you question the creeds? And it's like, well, the only reason I have any questioning of the creeds is because I stand on what the Bible says. I don't have a problem questioning the creeds. I don't have a problem challenging church history when I can read on the pages of the Bible where the creeds are wrong, where church history is wrong. I don't know why that is so challenging to so many people who claim to believe in the authority of Scripture. But it happens every day. So, anyway, I didn't mean to get sidetracked too much on that announcement of my upcoming book, but I really am excited about it. The book is currently about 230 pages long. It's not going to be much longer than that if it's any much longer. And so I know that I've probably left some questions unanswered, but I have attempted to answer the major questions that are out there, that and certainly the arguments that are made to justify the view that physical death was involved in the death of Adam, the death that was introduced through Adam. So, like I said, I'm very excited about it, and can't wait to ship it off to you, let you look at it. I've got a couple of other really good men, both of whom are academically accredited with their PhDs, who have agreed to review this book, to give me some review quotes. Very excited about that. And so that's just a tiny, tiny bit of what's on my plate right now. That's taking up the bulk of my time, with the exception of having to deal on Facebook, on a very daily basis, as you well know, William, with the detractors who seek to do nothing but criticize, and they do so sarcastically, and yet they invariably wind up impaling themselves on their own swords. At least that's certainly what's been happening lately.
That's absolutely correct. Well, I'm looking forward to getting the book to read it, and I'll be happy to give a review of it, and let's get it out in print and hopefully correct some of this misinformation that's out there. And until someone shows us that Adam laid down and stopped breathing the day that he ate, I think it's going to be a real challenge for them to prove that physical death was the penalty of sin in that chapter.
Well, I think you're exactly right. Well, let's get back to our discussion of the Messianic Temple. In preparation for tonight, I just sat down. I read back through Isaiah chapter 2. We've been focusing on Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. We haven't even gotten out of chapter 2 yet. But I wanted to just take another fresh look at this entire prophecy. As I've shared before, there's a little term that is used in Isaiah 2 through 4, and it's the little term, in that day. And that little term ties these three chapters together thematically and temporally. The temporal framework, the temporal context, as we've shared before, is it shall come to pass in the last days. Now, I think we're going to find tonight that when a person defines the last days as the Christian age, they're going to find some real difficulty with Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. William, you and I have talked before and talked about how being raised in the churches of Christ, the majority of times that we heard Isaiah referred to was, okay, it shall come to pass in the last days. On the day of Pentecost, the last days began. And the mount of the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the house, of the mountains. So the Lord's house is the temple. Well, Paul said, writing to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, these things I am writing unto you, hoping to come unto you shortly, but that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God. And so it was argued, see, Paul now calls the house of God the church. Therefore, the church is the temple. It's the Messianic Temple. Well, guess what, folks? I don't have a real problem with that argument. I think the house of God is the temple. I think the temple is the church. So that's not being questioned. The problem of it is when you identify the last days as the Christian age, then you have to deal with the rest of Isaiah chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4, all of which are confined to the last days. And the traditional view of the amillennial world, as well as, by and large, the postmillennial world, is that the last days began on Pentecost, and the last days is a reference to the entirety of the Christian age. Now, let me be fair. There are several in the postmillennial world, in what's known as the Reconstructionist world, men such as Gary DeMar, even Joel McDermott to a certain extent, to a great extent, are more than happy to acknowledge that the term the last days is not a reference to the Christian age by and large. That in the majority of the cases in which that term is used, it is a reference to the last days of Old Covenant Israel. Now, men such as Kenneth Gentry, on the other hand of that, still insist that the last days is a reference to the Christian age. Now, it's interesting to me that there's such a vast difference between those two camps, William. I mean, surely Kenneth Gentry can see a train coming if he were to take the view of the last days, refer to the last days of Old Covenant Israel, ending at AD 70. It is probably because he does see that train coming that he refuses to acknowledge that the last days is reference to the last days of Old Covenant Israel. Well, then you have men such as Gary DeMar, that I consider a friend. He's a great guy. But you have men like him, you have men like Joel McDermott, who insist that the last days is reference not to the Christian age, but to the last generation of Israel. William, how in the world, from a point of consistency, how in the world can a person argue that the last days is reference to the last generation of Old Covenant Israel and still be a futurist? Explain that to us.
I can't explain it. It's just difficult to even consider when you think about the last days being the last days of Israel, which is what the Bible actually teaches. I mean, even starting as early as Genesis 49, when Jacob called his sons to tell him what will befall them in the last days, certainly that's a reference to Israel. And to have some see a future last days beyond that point is just something that doesn't make any sense at all. And whether you're dealing with some of these men that you've mentioned or those from the amillennial camps from, the background that you and I have come, with trying to start the last days on the day of Pentecost is just rather bizarre as well. So I don't see how it can be reconciled. It hasn't been reconciled, and that's the problems that these guys are having with their eschatology. Well,
that's driven home to me by the fact, Kenneth Gentry, a man that I've had a great deal of respect for Kenneth Gentry for years. I have appreciated much of his writings. I sell some of his books. Of course, I have attempted, I've lost track of the number of times that Kenneth Gentry has been challenged either by others on my behalf or by me personally to engage me in formal public debate. He adamantly refuses. He says he is too busy writing books, too busy in his ministry. And yet, interestingly enough, while he's supposedly totally involved in writing books and ministry, he still finds the time to attack preterism every once in a while. He just came out a couple of days ago, well, last week I guess it was, just came out with another article, I am not a preterist. Yeah, here's a man, and even in the article, he admits that he has called himself a preterist in the past, and still does and still will, even though he objects to the use of preterist because the term has been hijacked by those of us who are what he calls hyper-preterist. Now, I said all that to say this. Kenneth Gentry announces in that article that he is currently writing a book on the Olivet Discourse, seeking to prove that it is a discussion of two separate events. The fall of Jerusalem, verses 4 through 34, or 35, and the end of time. Kenneth Gentry's underlying assumption, his presupposition, is that Matthew 24 talks about the supposed end of time. That's based upon his view that the last days is a reference to the Christian age. Well, if the last days equals the Christian age, then Kenneth Gentry's got to find some reference somewhere to the coming of the Lord at the so-called end of the age. I mean, after all, if you got the last days, then you got to have the last day. You got to have the time of the end, blah, blah, blah. So Kenneth Gentry is eisegetically reading the end of the Christian age into Matthew chapter 24 and 25. Now, the problem with that is Isaiah chapter 2 through 4 is a description of, and a panoramic view, if you please, of the last days. Now, we're focused on the establishment of the Messianic Temple. And believe it or not, folks, this is all directly related to I just saw the name Tim on television here, and it jumped right into my head. But it's directly related to Kenneth Gentry and his claims. It could justifiably be said, if you're going to take the position that the last days are the Christian age, that the Messianic Temple is under constant construction until the day of the Lord, and the day of the Lord in Isaiah chapter 2 climaxes the last days, which means that day of the Lord is the anointing, if you please, of the Messianic Temple. It's the finishing, the perfection of the Messianic Temple. You have initiation, you have consummation, you have the laying of the foundation, you have the completion of the temple. Those are absolutely perfectly biblical concepts. Now, our dispensational friends say, oh, well, you know, the last days is actually reference to the last days of Israel, and it's focused primarily on the 70th week, I should say, of Daniel chapter 9, that begins with the rapture, ends with the second coming. Well, strangely enough, if the 70th week ends at the second coming, then what in the world is the Lord doing dealing with Israel after the end of the 70 weeks? Because the 70 weeks are determined on the people and on the city. The 70th week is the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 32. But Deuteronomy 32 is about Israel's last end. It's not the beginning of her last days. It's her last end. It's the end of Israel. That's what Deuteronomy 32 says. And so what we find in the dispensational world, What we find in the postmillennial world by men such as Kenneth Gentry is utter, absolute confusion in regard to the framework for the Messianic Temple. Kenneth Gentry absolutely must have the Messianic Temple under construction now, instead of seeing that the foundation was laid in the first century and it was consummated at the coming of the Lord in AD 70, Revelation chapter 21. And by the way, this is important. Kenneth Gentry believes that Revelation 21, verses 1 and following, when it says, I saw the New Jerusalem coming down from God out of heaven, and a voice saying, the tabernacle of God is with man. Kenneth Gentry says that in spite of the traditional reading of that text, that is not talking about the end of the current Christian age. That is talking about the end of the Old Covenant world, the divorcement of Old Covenant Israel, and the full establishment, the wedding of Christ in AD 70. Well, my goodness gracious. How can you say things like that and say that the tabernacle of God is still being built? No, that's the completed tabernacle / temple coming down from God, glorified, magnified for man to dwell in. Here's the New Jerusalem that is completed, now glorified, now vindicated. And all the nations of the earth are coming to dwell in it. Kenneth Gentry says that's AD 70. And so to say that there's confusion out there in regard to these issues of the Messianic Temple and all revolving around the issue of the last days is, as I said, it is an incredible understatement and problematic. Final word here on Kenneth Gentry. You know, I would dearly love to debate Kenneth Gentry on whether or not Matthew chapter 24 and 25 can be divided into two different subjects. That would be a marvelous subject for debate. And if anyone is listening, either tonight live or those who will listen on the archives, if you want to get a hold of Kenneth Gentry and urge him to debate me on whether or not Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, is to be divided into two separate events, you have my blessing. Go for it. I would love to debate Kenneth Gentry on this subject. But I made a comment a moment ago, William, that anyone who takes the position that the last days is reference to the Christian age that began on Pentecost, they're going to run into very, very, very severe problems in Isaiah chapters 2, 3, and 4. Now, folks, let's keep in mind that the day of the Lord climaxes the last days. So let's look at chapter 3. Now, remember, it's been telling us, in that day, they'll run to the hills, they'll cry to the mountains, fall on us. Chapter 3. And keep in mind, folks, they didn't have chapter divisions when Isaiah was written. No chapter divisions at all. So don't be deluded or tricked, if you please, into thinking that chapter 3 is a break of subject. It's not. Anyway, for behold, the Lord of hosts does take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, the whole stay of water. Now, William, is it not true that in the amillennial world, certainly in the circles in which you and I were raised, is it not true that we were taught God was through with Israel at the cross?
Oh, that's a fundamental teaching in the amillennial framework where we were taught. That is a given that the old covenant was done with at the cross. Israel was done with at the cross, and everything starting Pentecost and forward was something totally new, divorced totally from Israel. One of the reasons why every time you got to a text like Romans 11, they sweat bullets.
That is an understatement. Yes. Well, this raises a serious question. If it is the case that Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 are one united prophecy, defined by the last days, to be climaxed by the day of the Lord. Then when Isaiah chapter 2 sets forth the framework of the last days, to be climaxed by the day of the Lord, and it says, for behold the day of the Lord. And remember, folks, we're still dealing with in that day of chapter 2, 19 to 21. For behold the Lord of hosts does take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread and the whole stay of water. Oh, William, if God was through with Israel at the cross, and the last days is reference to the Christian age and the church, then who in the world is Jerusalem and Judah in Isaiah 3, verse 1?
That's a real problem. That's a very real problem. I mean, the net result of their logic is that God will be dealing with Israel and Judah until the alleged end of time.
Exactly right. And yet that is fundamentally a violation of the amillennial perspective, and to a great extent, there are some caveats there, but to some great extent, that's what is taught in the postmillennial world. In the postmillennial world, they say that God cast Israel off in the first century, cast Israel off at AD 70, but in the postmillennial world, of course, at the end of the Christian age, national Israel is converted. They turn to Christ. That is fundamental. That is in the Westminster Confession of Faith. Greg Bahnsen, the late Greg Bahnsen, that I was actually supposed to have a debate with prior to his untimely demise, he said that's just prima facie true, and it's foundational to postmillennialism that at the end of the Christian age, Israel will be saved. Israel will be converted. Well, that's still Kenneth Gentry's perspective. Now, it's interesting, fascinating, and significant. Joel McDermott rejects that view. Gary DeMar rejects that view. And oh, by the way, some very, very prominent Reformed amillennialists reject that view. James Jordan, that I debated in 2003 in Florida, he said, Romans 11, 25 to 27, all Israel shall be saved, for the Redeemer shall come out of Zion when I take away their sins, for this is my covenant that I make with them when I take away their sin. James Jordan said that was fulfilled in AD 70. And that has been adopted primarily, mostly, by Gary DeMar and Joel McDermott. So, boy, what we have here is a real, I'm talking significant conundrum. You have leading postmillennialists who tell us, well, okay, yes, Romans 11 was fulfilled in AD 70, and the last days refer to were climaxed in AD 70, but you have men like Kenneth Gentry who tell us, well, Israel will be saved at the end of the Christian age. Well, how do you deal with Isaiah 3, verse 1? If God has cast off Israel now, if God is not dealing with Israel now, but will deal with Israel in the last days, then you're rejecting your own definition of the last days as the Christian age. Because these issues that are being talked about right here, these events that are being talked about in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 1, belong to the last days and the day of the Lord. Now, this is really, really problematic. And William touched on it there. If the last days refers to the Christian age, and if God was through with Israel at the cross, why is God saying that in the last days, in other words, in the Christian age, Judah and Jerusalem were going to be the object of his wrath? And what is he talking about here, by the way? Well, when he says he will take away the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread, the whole stay of water, that's, folks, that's nothing but famine. That is a famine. Now, if you read all the way down through chapter 3, and we don't have time to do all of that tonight. But when you read Isaiah chapter 3, pardon me, what is being described right here is without a doubt the description of famine. So that raises the question. Okay, if God was through with Israel at the cross, starting on Pentecost, the last days were established, and the last days of the Christian age. And in the Christian age, God's not dealing with Israel, Jerusalem, or Judah. Then why do we have here in Isaiah chapter 3 the prediction that in the last days and in the day of the Lord it would be a time of famine in Jerusalem and Judah? I mean, folks, this is really problematic. You can't just wave your hand at an issue like this. And, William, and some of the older amillennial and historicist commentators, I have witnessed the attempts to explain this. And they say, well, what we have here is that in the last days, Jerusalem and Judah, that's the church. And he'll take away the stay of bread and the stay of water. And what that means is that there will be a famine of the Word of God. Instead of it being bread and water, it's the Word of God. And instead of it being Jerusalem and Judah, it is the church. Now, if that's true, it's probably one time in which the church is ever referred to as Judah. I'm not aware of places. William, you might help me out here. Maybe I'm just ignorant. I'm not aware of the church ever being called Judah. It's called the New Jerusalem, to be sure. It's called the heavenly Jerusalem, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 21 and following. I'm unaware of the church ever being called Judah. Do you recall any place?
Nope, I don't recall.
So that would mean we've got some truly, truly distinctive language here. And, a person's got to prove their proclamation, their affirmation, that this is the church being talked about. And then, as we proceed into chapter 2, or chapter 3, excuse me, as we will proceed in this chapter, we will find that the rest of the descriptions of the events of the day of the Lord and the horrors of the day of the Lord, I'm sorry, folks, they just do not fit any kind of a historicist view of the church throughout the entirety of the Christian age. You have to be able to demonstrate that taking Judah and Jerusalem as the church has validity in this context. Now, again, we know that the church is called the New Jerusalem because the Bible is explicit about that in Hebrews chapter 12. And the New Testament application of some of those passages of the Old Testament, like Isaiah chapter 62, definitely refer to the church. But you see, you've got to prove it contextually in each passage. Those passages that talk about... Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say there's one other point in terms of Israel being involved in chapter 3. When you continue on in verse 2, he's saying, the whole supply of bread and whole supply of water being taken away in this judgment. But he also includes the mighty man and the man of war, the judge and the prophet. So if they're going to argue that this is the last days, they're going to have these prophets of Israel continuing all the way to the time of the end as well.
Until the day of the Lord, because remember, folks, the events here in chapter 3 are about what happens in the day of the Lord. Correct. Now, that day of the Lord is not a 24-hour period. And so we, as William is pointing out, you got to have the prophets of Israel continuing until the day of the Lord at the end of the Christian age. So do we have Israel's prophets continuing until the end of the Christian age? Well, if you got Israel's prophets continuing until the end of the Christian age, where do you insert the New Covenant prophets? Do we have Old Covenant prophets of Israel continuing at the same time as the New Covenant prophets of Jesus? Do they prophesy together? Well, that's an interesting proposition that most of our opponents would absolutely reject. But that's why William brought the point up. You cannot make bold assertions without offering some proof of what you are asserting. Now, look at verse 3. Here God is saying in verse 1 and 2, here's what I'm going to take away. The mighty man, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, the prudent, and the ancient. Okay. Remember, he's taking these things away from Judah, the mighty men, the man of war. Well, is Jerusalem and Judah supposed to have men of war until the end of time, until the end of the Christian age? Is that what people are going to say? And, William, I can just hear some of our dispensational friends going, well, just look at Jerusalem today. It's an armed camp.
I was thinking the very same thing.
A little bit of a digression here. As you know, William, I've become friends with this Hebrew scholar in Jerusalem. And what was it, last week or the week before, that Hamas was lobbing rockets over into Israel? I was very concerned about him. I didn't know how close he was, so I contacted him and asked him if he was near that firing line, and thankfully he was not. But he was talking about the constant tension that exists between Hamas and the people of Israel. He said there are just places that you, as a Jew, you just do not go because it's too close to the borders controlled by Hamas. He said you will get killed in those regions. And he said the reason that Egypt was willing to give up the land that Hamas and the Palestinians currently have and possess in the peace treaty, what was it, 1973? When was that? Somewhere along in there? Or was it 67? The reason Egypt was so willing to do that is because they consider Hamas to be a pack of raving, rabid dogs whose one goal in life is to destroy Israel. Now, you and I both know that we have severe reservations about whether or not the people who call themselves Israel are really Israel. We don't believe they're biblical Israel. But I suppose you could call them Jews because they ascribe to the Jewish religion in that definition of the word. But the very reality of living next door to someone, to anyone, whose avowed purpose in life is to destroy, kill, and slay every single one of you, it's difficult to imagine the tension and the stress and the anxiety that goes along with that. It's just not a happy situation.
Well, that certainly is the case. I mean, that's the case, in my judgment, on both sides of that issue.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, from the readings that I've done, it's almost a mutual intent. I think the propaganda that's put out there is that, okay, we're the victims, but the historical record shows different. And that's where the narrative gets sort of blighted in terms of what's going on.
Oh, I agree 100% with that. I mean, the American press, the world press, basically has attempted to make Israel completely and totally out the victim. When as a matter of fact, as you and I have discussed on this program many, many times, the absolute indisputable reality is the way they treat Palestinian Christians is absolutely abhorrent. It's unjust. It's cruel. Whole lots of other adjectives that you could apply to that. The authoritarian way. Well, the way that they kicked the Palestinians out of that land in the first place, it was just a travesty of justice. And, I mean, we both know what the dispensationalists say. We both know what the Zionists say. Well, that's just Israel's land by divine right. Well, of course, you and I we definitely dispute that. We don't believe they've got a divine right to that land at all. We know all the verbiage. We know all the claims. We believe that that is a misuse of the biblical language and the biblical teaching. Did they once have a divine right to the land? Yes, they did. Those promises were fulfilled. And if you want documentation of that, I would urge you to get a copy of my book, Israel 1948, Countdown to Nowhere, or get a copy of my later book, Misplaced Minds, A Refutation of Dispensationalism, which is an exegesis of Colossians chapter 2 and chapter 3, where Paul told his brethren, do not set your affections on the land. And, you know, William, I've got to tell you, the feedback that I continue to get from that little book is just amazing. When people see that Paul is not simply giving some homiletic exercise of, sermonizing basically to say, oh, you need to be heavenly minded, not earthly minded. That was not Paul's main point. Paul's main point was, do not set your affections on the land of Israel. Do not set your affection on the temple. Do not set your affection on the sacrifices, the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths, because they're shadows of things, of the better things that are coming, that are about to come. So, folks, if you want a fresh look at the land issue, I would suggest you get a copy of my book, Misplaced Minds. It can be found on my websites, DonKPreston.com or BibleProphecy.com. So all of those things, you see, ladies and gentlemen, have to think about this. If Israel no longer has a right to that land, as William and I both strongly affirm, then what does that do to the very claim of a future Messianic temple? They don't have a right to. If they don't have a right to the land, they don't have a right to build a temple there. Now, do the Muslims have a divine right to that mountain? No, they sure don't. William and I are arguing that no one has a divine right to that mountain. That mountain no longer has divine prophetic significance. It is a mountain, and that's all it is. Now, might we revere it from a historical perspective, because that's where everything took place? Well, I don't have a problem with that. My problem is when people start, quote, revering places like that, all of a sudden they want to call them sacred. They want to call them holy. They want to ascribe prophetic significance to those places when they no longer have prophetic significance. And that's the message that William and I continue to propound, continue to expound, because striking at the very heart of the Messianic Temple issue is, number one, the last days. They are the last days of Old Covenant Israel that ended in AD 70. In AD 70, biblical Israel came to an end. And, you know, William, were you part of the conversation on Facebook just recently when we were talking about the issue of the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic and what have you? I don't remember if you were a part of that study or not.
I think I missed that one. It was probably one that I would have enjoyed being a part of.
I know that I tagged you on it, but I knew that you were tremendously busy with so much of your other obligations and what have you. But, yes, it was a discussion with Sam Frost. And Sam Frost keeps appealing to Romans chapter 11 as predictive of a yet future coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel. And I have been pressing Sam to prove that ethnic, national, biblical Israel still exists today. I have challenged him no less than 7 or 8 times to prove that ethnic, racial, national Israel still exists. Well, he came up with a really cute argument the other day, about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, and he said, well, what Preston is missing is that in Acts chapter 17 it says, God made of one blood all nations of the earth. Since all nations are of one single blood, there is no such thing as race. There is no such thing as ethnicity. And you literally have to stand amazed at Sam Frost's desperation. And so I asked Sam, was there an Israel descended from Abraham who called themselves Israel after the flesh? Romans 9, 1-3. Well, he refused to answer it. Came back and repeated his argument about there's no such thing as race. He said the very idea of there being race is a relatively new idea, or actually he said racism is a relatively new thing. And interestingly enough, at least that has some validity of a claim. But to suggest that there's no such thing as race is such a strange argument for someone who claims to stress history so much, who claims that the testimony of history is so valid. So here's a guy who's claiming that he relies and accepts the testimony of history, and yet throughout history, what does it testify? To the reality of different races, of different people. And so when I questioned him or challenged him again, I said, you're saying that there's no such thing as people of the flesh, then explain to me what Paul meant in Romans chapter 10 and Romans chapter 11 when he said that he was of the tribe of Benjamin. Was the tribe of Benjamin from a given tribe of a given people? No answer. And it has been now 4 days since I challenged Sam Frost to deal with the issue of Israel after the flesh, descended from Abraham after the flesh. He refused to do it. Simply refused to do it. And it's staggering. It's literally staggering. God made promises to Israel, to Abraham, after the flesh. There was a twofold promise. Promises according to the flesh, promises according to the Spirit. Those physical promises belong to Israel according to the flesh. He promised to give them the physical land. He gave them the physical land. Promised to give them a city. He gave them a city. Promised to give them a Messiah according to the lineage of David, according to the flesh. Romans 1, verse 4. Now, there's more to that term, according to the flesh. I understand that. But it's certainly of the physical lineage of David, because that's what the genealogies established, of the fleshly descent from David of Jesus as the son of David. He was called the son of David, not strictly by covenant. That certainly is true, though. But he was called the seed of David, not strictly because of covenant, but because of his physical lineage from him. God kept those promises. Just like in Acts chapter 2, God swore with an oath that of the lineage of the seed of David, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to sit on the throne. He kept his promise. And he had promises to Israel after the flesh, that he would bring their covenant history to its close when he avenged all the blood of all of the martyrs who ever lived on the earth, and he would bring in the new creation, which would be comprised of those, number one, who are of Israel of the flesh, but primarily they were of Israel after the Spirit, children of the promise, whose physical lineage was in fulfillment of those physical promise, but primarily they're now the true sons of Abraham by faith, and they are joined by the Gentiles, who were not of Abraham according to the flesh, but they became the seed of Abraham by faith, Galatians 3:6 and following. Let me close here again by saying, if there is no such thing as ethnic national Israel today, there is no promise of a Messianic temple at all. And we'll have more to say from Isaiah chapter 3 and 4, but it looks like we're out of time. William, great to be with you as always. Folks, thank you for joining us here on Two Guys and a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. With that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys and a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.